Hi, welcome to the first video on convex sets. So before we go on to the contents, I'll provide a brief outline of what is going to be covered in this first video. So we'll first define affine subspaces, affine combinations, etc. Then we'll define convex sets, convex combinations, convex hull. Then we look at some properties of the convex hull. In particular, we look at the Carathéodory theorem. Then we look at some basic but important examples of convex sets. After which we'll deal with what is called the isolation theorem. So we'll first prove this isolation theorem for general vector spaces. Then we'll look at some properties of convex sets in Euclidean spaces, and we'll prove a specialized version of the isolation theorem that is valid only on Euclidean spaces. So this will be the general contents of this video. I'll also be providing the timestamps for each theorem and proposition in my YouTube description. Before we go on to the definition of convex sets, we first introduce the concept of affine subspaces and affine combinations, etc. So our first definition is suppose V is a vector space. And L subset of V is a linear subspace. Then any set of the form any set of the form of a linear subspace plus a translation vector V is an affine subspace of V. For example, if you are in R2 and this is your linear subspace L passing through the origin, then any translation of L, say by like 1 unit, this L plus 1, or like this, these are all affine subspaces of R2. The affine subspace of dimension 1 is given a special name called a straight line. So a second definition. If our linear subspace L has dimension 1, then any affine subspace of the form L plus V is called a straight line. So you can have a different parameterization for a straight line. For example, if A is a straight line, then you can write this A as some V plus tau times U, where tau element of R. So this will be a straight line passing through V and in the direction of U. We now define a linear functional. Again, suppose V is a vector space. any function f from V to R that satisfies for all alpha beta in real and for all VW in the vector space. So this is linear functional. So now we will not prove the next statement, but we'll be using it throughout. You can look at the proof in any linear algebra textbook. So the idea is that the space of all linear functionals is called the dual space of V, and it's denoted by V star. So along with V being a vector space, if V has an inner product structure, then there is this theorem called Riesz representation theorem. Which says that any element of the dual space, that is any linear functional, can be represented as, like, some f of x can be written as. So what this says is that any linear functional can be written as taking some inner product with some vector v in a vector space, in the vector space. So also this vector space in Euclidean, when the vector space is the RD, normal Euclidean space, you can write this inner product as X transpose V. So we'll be using this notation throughout, but the equivalence comes from Riesz representation theorem. That is, we are writing a linear functional as an inner product, and an inner product as some vector dot product. Using the definition of a linear functional, we define an affine hyperplane. So again, V is a vector space. So an affine hyperplane H is a set of all x such that f of x is some alpha, where alpha element of real number and f is some linear function. So from the equivalence that was defined just some time ago, we can write this hyperplane as x such that x inner product of x with v is some alpha, or equivalently x is the hyperplane is set of all x such that x transpose v is alpha. So we now invoke the rank nullity theorem. So if you look at this linear functional f, it's a map from vector space to R. So the kernel of f is the set of all x such that f of x is 0. And image of f, you can convince yourself that it is the entire R. So if you invoke the rank nullity theorem, dimension of kernel of f plus dimension of image of f is dimension of V. So therefore, if V is d-dimensional and this is 1, so dimension of kernel of f is d minus 1. So what you are seeing is that the dimension of this hyperplane. So it doesn't matter if f of x is 0 or f of x is a constant alpha. Uh, that the dimension of the hyperplane is 1 subtracted from the dimension of the vector space. Now we come to the definition of affine combination and affine independence. So here's our definition. Given some points x1 etc. up to xm lying in some vector space or Rd, some V or Rd, then affine combination of these points is a linear combination of the form alpha 1 x1 plus etc. alpha m xm such that alpha 1 plus etc. alpha m equal to 1. So the way to think about this is this. If you write this alpha 1 in terms of these other alphas by taking them to the right hand side and substitute it back into this equation, what you'll get is x1 plus alpha 2 x2 minus x1 plus etc. up to alpha m xm minus x1. So what you're seeing here is the base point is origin is now x1, and now we are taking m minus 1 linear combinations of this m minus 1 vectors. So the set of all affine combinations form and of m points form an m minus 1 dimensional space if these points are linearly independent. We now define what is meant to be affinely independent. Set of points is said to be affinely independent when the only solution to alpha 1 x1 plus etc. alpha m xm is 0, and alpha 1 plus etc. alpha m is 0 is that all the alpha i's are 0. So the connection between the definition of affine combination and affine independence is this. Affine independence, this condition is the exact condition for the affine combination of m points to be represented uniquely. We now provide an alternate characterization of affine independence. So our first proposition. A set of points x0, x1, etc. up to xm is affinely independent if and only if the set x1 minus x0 up to xm minus x0 is linearly independent. So to show this, suppose assume that the set is affinely independent. So that means that the only solution to sum over I alpha I xi equal to 0 and sum over I alpha I is equal to 0 is that all the alpha i's are 0. Now let us examine the consequence of check whether it's linearly independent. For that to happen, alpha 1 x1 minus x0 plus etc. Alpha m xm minus x. So if the only solution to this is all the alpha is at 0, then it's linearly independent. Now we expand this, you get here, notice that this is in fact an affine combination because the sum over all the coefficients add up to 0. So because it's affinely independent, it turns out that all the alpha is at 0, hence x1 minus x0, etc. up to xm minus x0 is linearly independent. And this direction is entirely reversible. So you can in fact just argue in the opposite direction to show that if it's linearly independent, then the other side is affinely independent. With this proposition, we can easily come to the following conclusion. The maximum number of in RD is d plus 1. This is because if you had a set of more than d plus 1 points, which was affinely independent, then the set of d minus 1 differences like this, it will be linearly independent. But that is not possible because the maximum number of linearly independent points in RD is d. We'll now prove another proposition that is useful when we come to quotient vector spaces. So the proposition is this. If L is a linear subspace of a vector space V, then L plus U is the same affine subspace as L plus V, if and only if V minus U lies in L. So proof is this. Suppose you pick any point x element of L plus U. This means that there exists some z element of L such that x is z plus U. Now because x is also element of L plus V, this implies that there exists some W element of L such that x is W plus V. But since these are both same, Z plus U must be equal to W plus V, which implies this implies that U minus V must be equal to W minus Z. And because W and Z lies in the same linear subspace L, the difference must also lie in the subspace, hence this must lie in L. Now notice that this direction is entirely reversible. You can actually write double implies here. Hence, we have proved the if and only if condition. Before we define convex sets, we'll first define convex combination and a special case of the convex combination called line segment. So, given points x1, etc. up to some xm lying in RD, a convex combination of these points is a linear combination of the form alpha 1 x1 plus etc. alpha m xm with the condition that alpha 1 plus alpha m is 1. So this is just like affine combination, but with the added condition that all the alpha i's are positive. A special convex combination which we will use often is line segment. So given x comma y that lies in RD, a line segment between them is a set. So this set is denoted by this symbol x comma y. So this line segment is also called an interval between x comma y. We now define a convex set. So a set A subset of RD is called convex if given any 2 points x comma y in A, the line segment joining them also lies in A. So this is called convex. So you can say visualize the definition of convexity in R2 with these examples. Maybe like if you have a square or a circle, if you take any 2 points, the line segment joining them lies in the set itself. So these are convex sets in R2. Like if you had a set like this, and if you took these 2 points, then the line segment between them does not lie in the set. So this is not convex. So these are just basic examples. We'll come to more pertinent examples later. We now have another definition. So just like the affine hull, we can define the convex hull. So given a set S, the convex hull of S denoted as is the set of all convex combinations of points in S. So to visualize this definition, suppose you are in some R2 and you had some points like this. So the convex hull would be the polygon connecting these 2 points. I mean these points. So the shaded region will be the convex hull of these particular points. So we just defined the convex hull. We now explore some properties of the convex hull. So our first proposition is this. Suppose S is a set, then the convex hull of S is a convex set. Moreover, convex hull of S is the smallest convex set which contains a set S. So we prove this. So suppose you take any 2 points from the convex set, convex hull. Then X would be of the form sum over I equal to 1 to M alpha I Si, where this is a convex combination and some Si, all the Si's are lying in S. And Y would be some other convex combination, J equal to 1 to N beta J Sj tilde, where this Sj tilde also lies in S. This is from the definition of convex hull. Now we consider any convex combination of X and Y. So this would be the set sum over I equal to 1. I mean, this would be the point I equal to 1 to M gamma alpha I Si plus sum over J equal to 1 to N 1 minus gamma beta J Sj tilde. So we just have to show that this is a convex combination. To check that, we just need to check that the sum of the coefficients are all 1, because we already know that all the coefficients are positive. So gamma sum over I alpha I plus 1 minus gamma sum over J beta J. So these all add to 1 because X and Y are convex combinations. So this will become 1 and this will also become 1. So this will end up just gamma plus 1 minus gamma. This is just 1. So it is indeed a convex combination. So any such convex combination, that is, so we have just proved that the line segment between X and Y contains lies in convex hull of S. So convex hull of S is indeed a convex set. So now to show that the convex hull is the smallest convex set to contain S, what we have to show is that if some A is any other convex set such that A contains S, what we have to show is that any convex combination of points in S lies in A. So the problem here is that from the definition of convexity, we only assume that the line segment between any 2 points lies in A. What we have to show is more general, that convex combination of finite points lies in A. So our method of proof is this. We prove this by induction. So what we have to prove is that if all line segments lie in the set, implies all convex combinations, all finite convex combinations lie in the set. So this is what you have to prove, and you prove this by induction. So we prove the statement by induction. So for n equal to 2, we already know this from the definition of convexity, that is alpha x plus 1 minus alpha y element of A for all 0 less than or equal to alpha less than or equal to 1 for all x comma y element of S. So now by the induction hypothesis, we assume that it is true for all n less than k. Now we consider the case n equal to k. So suppose you had a convex combination alpha 1 plus alpha 1 x1 plus etc. alpha k xk. What you can do is this. You take the first k minus 1 things plus alpha k minus 1 by the sum plus alpha k xk. So if you notice, this k minus 1 is now a convex combination of, it's now a convex combination because all the coefficients are positive and they add up to 1. By the induction hypothesis, since our statement is true for all n less than k, this must lie in A. Now, if you look at this coefficient, let's call gamma, because the original thing is a convex formation. This must be 1 minus gamma. So what you have is now a convex combination of just 2 points. What you have done is you took a convex combination of k points. You first broke up into a convex combination of k minus 1 points in the inner bracket, and outer bracket it was a convex combination of 2 points. So by our induction hypothesis, all of this lies in A. Hence, this whole convex combination itself lies in A. So we are done with the proof. We now come to another property of the convex hull, that is the Carathéodory theorem. So before I give the statement of the theorem, I'll give the intuitive explanation. So suppose you are in say R2 and you had all these points. Say so now when you take the convex hull of all these points, it will turn out to be this polygon. But in order to describe any point in this convex hull, you don't need all the say 100 points that you had originally had before taking the convex hull. You just need some 3 points that form a triangle to describe any point inside the convex hull. So this is the intuition for Carathéodory theorem. No matter how large S is, in order to describe any point in the convex hull of S, you don't need all the points in S. You just need the number of points that is limited by the dimension in which this set lies. So this is the main intuition for Carathéodory theorem. I'll now provide the theorem statement. So the statement is this. So any point in the convex hull of a set S that is contained in Rd can be described by as a convex combination of at most d plus 1 points. In S. So this is the problem statement. We'll now prove this. Suppose X was any point in the convex hull of S. Then by definition, X must be a convex combination of some number of points. some yi where all the yi lies in S. So if M is less than d plus 1, we are done. So but however, if M is greater than d plus 1, then we need to reduce it to a convex combination of d at most d plus 1 point. So the way to do this is you have this collection y1 to ym. So if M is greater than d plus 1 and all these yi's it was lying in Rd, then from our earlier result, these points must be assignedly dependent. So what this means is that the set of equations gamma 1 y1 plus etc. plus gamma m ym equal to 0 and gamma 1 plus gamma m equal to 0. This set has a non-trivial solution. So this means that you can express one of these yi's as some linear combination of the other yi. Now the question arises, which y do you express in this way? So that depends on the condition that this final thing has to be a convex combination. So you cannot just write any yi with a non-zero gamma in terms of the other yi. You need to choose the particular yi depending on because the final result has to be a convex combination. We will now explore this consequence. Let us choose, for now, let us choose some yi and write it in terms of the other yi. So you can write some yi0 is minus sum over I gamma I by gamma I0, I not equal to I0 y from this. Now you substitute this here and you get x as sum over I equal to 1 to m alpha I yi plus alpha I0 I not equal to I0 alpha I0 yi 0. Substituting this here, we have this will be equal to sum over I equal to 1 to m I not equal to I0 alpha I minus alpha I0 gamma I by gamma I. So now we want that all these coefficients be positive. So that would mean alpha I by gamma I is greater than alpha I0 by gamma I0. So this will give us the condition as to which gamma to choose. So we define now gamma I0 the I0 as the index minimum value. So with this choice, all these coefficients are positive, and because of this condition, you can say that they all add up to 1. So we are done. So this very interesting theorem, the main idea was in a Euclidean space of dimension d, you cannot have more than a d plus 1 affinely independent point, and we use that condition to reduce any large convex combination into a convex combination of at most d plus 1 points. We will now come to some basic but very important examples of convex sets. The first example is polyhedron. So basically polyhedron is the intersection of a finite number of inequalities of the form. So this is the official definition of polyhedron. So for example, in R2, so what these are this is a linear functional. So you are saying that x lies to the left side of a particular hyperplane. So for example, in R2, you could have a polyhedron like something like this. So this will be the intersection of two inequalities. One that says that points lie to the down like this region of this particular line, and to the left of this particular line. So this is a polyhedron. We can show that a polyhedron is a convex set because suppose x comma y element of the polyhedron P, then this means that x ci must be less than or equal to beta I for all I, and y ci must be less than or equal to beta I for all I. If you chose a convex combination of x and y, something like gamma x plus 1 minus gamma y, then if you look at the inner product with any ci, because of the linearity property of the first entry of the inner product, you can expand this as since each of this is less than or equal to beta I, you will get gamma times beta I plus 1 minus gamma times beta I, which is beta I. Thus, we see that any convex combination obeys this property. Note that we use the fact that gamma lies between 0 and 1 in this step. So you need both these coefficients to be positive for this less than or equal to inequality to hold. The second example is what is called a polytope. So a polytope C is simply a convex hull of affinely independent points. Say V12 or V02, some Vk. So basically, C is any is a set of all points of the form theta 0, V0 plus etc. Theta k Vk such that all the theta i's are greater than 0 and some more I theta is 1. So this is a polytope. We'll now try to write this polytope as a polyhedron. So in order to do that, we first write this some more I theta I equal to 1 condition and substitute here. Substitute the theta 0 in terms of the other theta I. That becomes V0 plus theta 1 V1 minus V0 plus etc. Theta k Vk minus V0 with the condition that all the theta i's are positive. So we have reduced one condition. Now you can write this in a more compact form as V0 plus a matrix B times column vector theta, such that this column vector theta is greater than or equal to 0. Here B is this n cross k matrix V1 minus V0 columns Vk minus V2. It's some n cross k. Now, because V1 minus V0, etc., up to Vk minus V0, they are linearly independent, because by definition, V0 to Vk are affinely independent. So that means this B is of maximal rank. Of K. Then this means that there exists a matrix A, n cross n matrix A, which is written as A1, A2, such that A1, A2 dot B is the 1 matrix and 0 matrix. Okay, so the way to see this is this. Imagine a linear transformation A from Rn to Rk, and this Rk is seen as a subspace of Rn by the standard inclusion map. So if you imagine this V1 linear transformation A that does takes each Vi minus V0 to Ei element of Rk, and if you write the matrix of this linear transformation in the basis, standard basis in Rn and the standard basis in Rk, you get this matrix A. Now, if you multiply this equation with this matrix A, what you get is, so X element of C, if and only if V0 plus B theta, X is of the form V0 plus B theta, where theta greater than 0. Now, if you multiply it with A, what you get is A1 V0, A2 V0 plus theta. Because A dot B is 1 dot 0, only the first part of this a matrix gets theta, the lower part is 0, hence this theta does not appear. So what you get is this. This is A dot x, A1 dot x, and A2 dot x. So what you're saying is, now theta greater than or equal to 0, you can substitute theta as A1x minus A1 V0. So what you're saying is that X element of C, if and only if A1x minus A1 V0 greater than or equal to 0, and A2x is A2 V0. So we see here that it's a collection of inequalities and equalities. Hence, this is a standard form of a polyhedron. So we have essentially written a polytope, that is convex hull of affinely independent points, as a polyhedron. We come to the third example, the standard d-dimensional simplex. So delta is a subset of Rd plus 1. Such that all this it sums to 0. Sums to 1, and they are all positive. So essentially in R2, you will have the one-dimensional simplex, which is a line, and in R3, you will have the two-dimensional simplex, which is a triangle. the three-dimensional simplex of a tetrahedron, it lies in R4 and hence you cannot draw it. Our fourth example is hyperplanes and half spaces. So we had already defined the hyperplane. So we had defined a hyperplane as H as the set of all x such that some f of x is alpha, where alpha element of R. We had also, by the Riesz representation theorem, written it as inner product with some vector is alpha, and we also had this other notation for inner product x transpose v is alpha for some alpha element of real numbers and a v element of Rd. Now the complement of the hyperplane under Rd, that is the union of two open sets which are called the H plus and H minus, the positive half plane and the half space and the negative half space. So H plus is essentially the set of all x such that inner product of x with v is greater than alpha, and H plus, and H minus is the set of all x such that xv is less than alpha. So this is the positive and negative open half spaces. H plus and H minus are open sets. Now H plus union H is called as is written as H plus bar. This is the closure of H plus, and it's called the closed half space, closed positive or upper half space. And H minus union H is called the closed lower half space. So these are both closed sets. So one way to see a half space is, suppose say you are in R2. This is a line. Hyperplanes in R2 are lines. So say you take some hyperplane xv is alpha. One way to, so this v will be perpendicular to this half space, hyperplane, and any point x in this half space can be seen to make positive angles with this v. In any vector in this h plus is seen to make positive angles with v, and any vector in this is seen to make negative angles with v. So that is a geometric way to visualize half spaces. Our fifth example is norm balls and ellipsoids. So we'll first define a Euclidean ball, and then we'll come to other norm balls. So a Euclidean ball is any set of the form the set of all x such that mod x minus x0, okay, let's call it R, is less than or equal to R, where here the norm is the Euclidean norm. So like in R2, if this is your x0 and your radius is 1, you will have this closed ball of radius 1 centered at x0. You can also represent this in the form x0 plus Ru, where mod u is less than or equal to 1. This is an equivalent representation. Now we come to other norm balls. So in general, there's this P norm in Rd. So which is defined as P norm of some point in Rdx is defined as x1 to the p plus etc. xd to the p to the power 1 by p. So you can easily see that like if p equal to 2, this is the standard Euclidean distance norm. Now you can visualize how other norm balls look. For example, if p equal to 1 and the radius is 1 and the center is 0, your norm ball will look like this diamond shape. Your R2 would look like this. Your R4 would look something like this. And your R infinity will be the square. This is a norm ball. So if you represent the norm by this BP, so this will be B infinity of 0, 1. This will be say B4, 0, 1. The circle will be B2, 0, 1. And this diamond shape will be D1, 0. So you can see that all the other like norms between 4 and infinity will be contained in the small space. We now come to the ellipsoid. So if you see this definition of norm ball has this term, a set of conditions, set of all x such that x minus x0, some norm is less than or equal to r. You can rewrite this as, you can square both sides and then you will get this particular equation. Now, if this norm came from an inner product, say as in the case of the 2 norm, then you can write this x minus x0, x minus x0. Now you can extend this definition to define ellipsoids. So ellipsoids, the definition look like this. So set E is the set of all x such that x minus x0 in a product with some matrix P is less than r square. So this matrix P, it has to be a symmetric positive definite, strictly positive definite. Now, because this matrix is positive definite, you can write this P inverse as some unitary transformation, some diagonal, and so another unitary matrix. So this is the standard diagonalization of a symmetric matrix. Because it's positive definite, all these will be positive quantities, strictly positive quantities. So the eigenvalues of this lambda inverse, they define the length of the semi-major axis or something of the ellipse. So this length and this length are characterized by the eigenvalues 1 over lambda, 1 over root lambda actually, and the angle in which the ellipse is oriented, that is determined by the eigenvectors which diagonalize this matrix. We now go on to the one very important theorem, the isolation theorem. So we prove it for general vector spaces. So before we go on to the statement of the isolation theorem, we need to introduce certain definitions. One of which is quotient vector spaces, and the other is the definition of algebraically of a set being algebraically open. So we'll first define quotient vector spaces. So suppose V is a vector space. and L subset of V is a linear subspace of V. We define the quotient vector space of V under L. So it's denoted by this symbol. The elements of this set are all the affine subspaces parallel to L. So earlier we saw that from the definition of affine subspaces that they are exactly a linear subspace translated by a vector. So in the context of quotient vector spaces, this L plus U is also denoted by this symbol, square bracket U within square brackets. So we now, so what we have done is we have just defined the set V by L. We now define addition and scalar multiplication so as to make this into a vector space. The way to do this is so while these statements might seem trivial, it is in fact actually not, because the problem lies in the fact that there could be multiple vectors U such that they give rise to the same affine subspace. For example, L plus U1 could be we earlier in the section on affine spaces, we showed that if this was the case, then U1 minus U1 tilde belongs to L. So one can use this property to check that these definitions are satisfied. That is, suppose the same affine subspace was represented by some U1 tilde one can show that these two statements are equivalent when this is satisfied. So in fact, these statements are not trivial, and this defines the quotient vector space. Now, given the definition of this quotient vector space, there's a natural projection operator phi from V to V by L. This is the action of pi on any element in V is defined as this. So it maps every vector to L, the translation of L by that vector. So this is the definition of the projection operator. Now one can see that this projection, this map, it is surjective. So we can apply the rank nullity theorem. This okay, before we apply the rank nullity theorem, we note that the zero element of this vector space is L plus 0 or L. Therefore, all vectors in L, phi of V is 0 for all V element of L. So the kernel of this map is exactly L. So now we can apply the rank nullity theorem. This dimension of the kernel dimension of the range of pi is dimension of V. Now kernel of pi is exactly L. So dimension of L, and range of pi is the whole space quotient vector space. So we might use this fact later on. We'll now consider an example of a quotient space. Suppose we are in R2. So our V is now R2, and we look at, say, this line L. So this is our linear subspace. Then the elements of V by L will be all these lines parallel to L. So all these will be elements of V by L. And suppose you took this point V. So the projection of V would be the line parallel to L passing through V. So that is phi of V. And as you can see, L has dimension 1. So this means that from our rank nullity theorem, dimension of V by L is 1. So it will be characterized by, maybe say, you can think of it as like all vectors perpendicular to this line. That will characterize the dimension 1 of this V by L. We now define what is meant for a set to be algebraically open. So let V be a vector space. Let A be a convex set. Then A is said to be algebraically open. Like if you choose any line, if you take any line, L, then L intersection A is an open interval. So by an open interval, we mean either some set that is terminated at A that could go to infinity, some set from minus infinity that is terminated at some A, or it could be like some A to B, or it could be empty. These are all possibilities when you say open interval. So it's not just an open set, it's an open interval. Like, so that's the difference. So we note here that this definition of algebraically open is aimed at infinite dimensional vector spaces. In RD or in any finite dimensional Euclidean space, the definition of algebraically open coincides with that of open. So I'm not proving it here, but you can prove this by contradiction. For the case of RD, before we go on to the isolation theorem, we have one more definition. What it is meant to isolate. So we define that. Suppose A is any set in a vector space. A hyperplane H is set to isolate A when A is contained in one of the closed half spaces. When either A is contained in H plus bar or A is contained in H minus bar. So strict isolation means, and when A is contained in one of the open half spaces. We now state and prove the isolation theorem. Let V be a vector space, and A subset of V is an algebraically open convex set. And U is some point that is not in it. Then there exists a hyperplane H such that U is contained in H, and H strictly isolates it. So we'll prove this in some steps. We'll first show the result for dimension 2, and then we'll show it for higher dimension. So proof. So before we begin the proof, without loss of generality, we can assume that U is 0, because if not, we can translate the whole thing so that U lies at 0. So without loss of generality. Now we'll show the result for uh, uh, dimension 2. So in order to make things clear, we can draw a diagram. So this is our U. Maybe this is some open convex set. Consider the unit circle S. So what we'll now do is project this A onto S. In this case, the circle will look something like this. This is the unit circle S, and you are going to project this. So the projection will be this open arc gamma. By projection, we mean take all points V element of A and apply V by the length of V. So that will lie in the unit circle. So this arc will be connected because, and we'll get this at capital gamma. This gamma is connected because A is convex. And furthermore, this gamma is open. So how do we see this? Choose any x element of gamma. Okay, by open, what we have to show is that if you take any x in this open set, what you have to show is that there exists an open interval such that x is contained in that open interval, and that open interval is in turn contained in gamma. So let us choose this x element of gamma. This means that there exists some v element of A such that x is the projection of v. Now, because the set A is algebraically open, consider the line L through x, line L through V tangential to the direction of x. So I'll explain this in a moment using this diagram. But first, this line L is passing through V tangential, the direction is tangential to x. Then L intersection A is an open interval of a line by the definition of algebraically open. Then if you project this L intersection A onto this unit circle, you will get your required open set containing it. So what you have shown is that gamma is both connected and open. Furthermore, gamma, the length of gamma cannot be greater than pi. This is because if it is greater than pi, it will contain two antipodal points. By antipodal, you mean both x and minus x. That's a pair of antipodal points. So its length cannot be greater than gamma, pi. The length of gamma cannot be greater than pi. Because if it were so, you take a pair of antipodal points and their convex combination will be 0, that is u. But by our assumption, u is not in it, so this cannot be the case. So what you have then is some unit circle and some gamma that is like has a length of less than pi. So what you do is the line passing through the origin and passing through one of these endpoints. That will give you your required hyperplane. Okay, you have to note that hyperplane in R2 is a line. So we have proved the theorem in dimension 2. So before I proceed, I'll just explain these steps using the diagram. So choose any x here. That means there exists some A, there exists some B in A. This is your A. This is your V. Now consider the line passing through V and tangential to x. So that will be this line. Then this L intersection A, you project it back to the unit circle. So it will be some interval like this. So this is your open interval to show that this gamma is open. We will now use this earlier proved result in R2 or in dimension 2 to prove the isolation theorem for higher dimensions. So first, okay, let us consider a dimension of V greater than or equal to 2. First, we'll show that statement 1. We'll show that there exists a line L such that L intersection A is null, U element of L. So to show this, consider the point U. We already know U not in A. consider any two-dimensional hyperplane, two-dimensional plane passing through U. Let P be some 2D plane. So this P may or may not intersect A. It doesn't matter to us. So so if it doesn't intersect, then you can choose any line in P. If it intersects, then what you have is in this plane you are in two dimensions. So using our earlier proof, there exists a line. So you have that line. So we are we are done with our first statement. Now we'll use this statement to prove the actual result in higher dimension. So in this higher dimension, let H be the maximal hyperplane such that U element of H and H isolates A. We already know there exists a line, but we are now saying that let H be the maximal hyperplane, maximal dimension hyperplane, such that it satisfies the statement of the theorem. We'll now show that H cannot be anything but the highest dimensional hyperplane. Suppose not. Then from our rank nullity theorem for the quotient vector spaces, we know that if H is not the highest dimensional space, then dimension of V by H is greater than or equal to 2. Now consider the projection pi from V to the quotient V under H, quotient V by H. The projection of A, pi of A, is an algebraically open set. Set in V by H. Furthermore, H intersection A is empty by assumption. This means that pi of 0, which is H, is not contained in pi of A. So now pi of 0 is a point in V by H such that it's not contained in pi of A. And dimension of V by H is greater than or equal to 2. Then by our statement 1, there exists a line L in V by H such that pi of 0 is contained in L, and L intersection pi of A is empty. Now consider the set G, which is the inverse of L under this projection. Now, because this pi is a linear map, the inverse of, and L is a subspace, L is a linear subspace in V by H, the inverse of L under pi is also a subspace in V. Because pi of 0 is contained in L, pi of 0 is H itself. This implies that H is contained in G. Furthermore, G intersection A is null because G intersection A is contained in G intersection phi inverse of phi of A. But G is phi inverse of L. This implies that this is contained in phi inverse of L intersection phi of A by the property of the inverse of functions. Null set by our assumption. Hence, this is a null set. Thus, G is now a larger hyperplane in V, which contains H and hence contains U. And H is contained in G. Thus, you have violated the assumption that H was the maximal hyperplane, which means that the only conclusion is that H has to be the hyperplane of maximum possible dimension. Thus, we are done. So essentially, we have proved that in a vector space of any dimension, given an algebraically open set and given a point that does not lie in that set, you can find a hyperplane of the maximum dimension in V such that the point is contained in the hyperplane and the hyperplane strictly isolates the set. So we had earlier discussed the isolation theorem in a general vector space, possibly even infinite dimensional. But now we come to the specific setting of RD, Euclidean space, in which we can prove slightly more general isolation theorem. So we need to introduce some definitions and some propositions before we go on to that. So we introduce some of the background which is relevant to Euclidean spaces. So the first is the definition of interior. So given a set A, a point U element of A is said to lie in the interior. Interior of A if there exists a open ball B with a center at U and some radius epsilon, where epsilon is positive real number, such that B of U epsilon is contained in A. So, for example, you are in the real line and you take the open interval 0 to 1. So, any point in this, say, 1/3, it lies in the interior because you can consider the small open interval of radius some 1/10 or something, and it will be contained in this interval 0 to 1. So 1/3 lies in the interior of this set A. Is like here it's 0 to 1. The set of all interior points of A is denoted by int of A. The set of all interior points of A and the set of all points of A which are not in the interior is said to lie in the boundary of A, denoted by BD. BD of A is the set A interior of A subtracted from A, and it's called the boundary. We now prove a useful lemma. Suppose A is some set in RD and is a we now prove a useful lemma. Suppose A is a convex set in RD. And let U0 be some point in the interior of A. So we assume that A has non-empty interior. And let U1 be any point in A. Then the claim is that any point of the form U alpha where 1 minus where 0 less than or equal to alpha less than 1. Notice this difference here. The claim is that any such point U alpha lies in the interior of it. So the way to see this is you can like draw some diagram. So let us choose any point U0 in the interior of A, and you could choose any point U1 here. By definition, if U0 is in the interior, so there exists an epsilon bond which lies completely in A. Now you can draw this cone with the base at U1. Then you can see that U alpha is like this line joining U0 and U1. And if you take any point U alpha here, which is at alpha distance from U0, the alpha ratio of the distance from U0 between U0 and U1, you can draw a smaller bond. So if you draw the perpendicular to these lines, then the angle here is same. So you can see that sine theta is let's call this is epsilon, and let's call this epsilon alpha. Sine theta will be epsilon by mod U0 minus U1, and sine theta is also equal to epsilon alpha by mod U0 minus U1. Oh, sorry, mod U alpha minus U1. Now you substitute this form of U alpha here. So you see that sine theta is equal to epsilon alpha by 1 minus alpha into mod U0 minus U1. This you see that if you take an epsilon bond with epsilon alpha bond with 1 minus alpha times epsilon 0 epsilon. So if you take a ball of radius epsilon alpha at U alpha, it will be completely contained in A. So we are done. We now use the earlier lemma to prove this interesting lemma. It says that if A subset of RD is a convex set, then interior of A is also convex. So you choose some U0, U1 in interior of A. Then you look at any convex combination of these points. That will be like 1 minus alpha U0 plus alpha U1. So for alpha less than or equal to 0, less than 1, we have the earlier lemma. Because U0 element of interior of A. And when alpha equal to 1, this whole thing becomes equal to U1, which already lies in interior of A by definition. So you are done. Next, I'll write down two propositions, but I will not prove them here. The proof can be found in the handwritten notes that I have uploaded along with the video. So our first proposition is if V1 to VD, V0 to VD are D plus 1 affinely independent points, points in RD, that is the maximum number of possible affinely independent points in RD, then the delta, that is the Pareto convex hull of V0 to VD, it has a non-empty interior. The next proposition is that if A is a subset of RD such that A has a non-empty interior and H is a hyperplane which isolates interior of A, then H isolates A. So this statement can be seen very intuitively, like if you draw some pictures, but you can also show them rigorously, and the proof is provided in my notes. Next, we come to a interesting theorem. Theorem is this: if A subset of RD is a convex set, such that interior of A is null, that it doesn't have any interior, then there exists a affine subspace L of strictly lower dimension. Such that A is contained in L and A has a non-empty interior. In L. So the way to prove this is this. Our statement is that there cannot exist V0 to VD which are affinely independent and contained in A. So the reason is that we had this earlier proposition which said that if you have the maximum number of affinely independent points in maximum number of affinely independent points, then their affine hull, then their convex hull must contain its interior must be non-empty. So, but here by assumption, our interior of A is empty. So there cannot exist D+1 points in A which are affinely independent. Then let say V1 to Vk be the maximum number of affinely independent points. In A. So now if you take any point V in A, the set of equations gamma 1 V1 plus etc. Gamma k Vk plus gamma V equal to 0 and gamma 1 plus gamma k plus gamma equal to 0, it must have a non-trivial solution. The reason being V1 to Vk is the maximum number of affinely independent points. That means V1 to Vk along with V is not affinely independent. So this must have a non-trivial solution. And in particular, this gamma must be non-zero. Because if gamma were 0, you will only have V1 to Vk and which are affinely independent. So this would only have trivial solution. Therefore, we can write this V as sum over I equal to 1 to k minus gamma by gamma k times Bi. Notice that all this sum to 1 because of this condition. Therefore, this is an affine combination. You are writing any V element of A as an affine combination of V1 to Vk. Thus, if you choose as your subspace L the affine hull of V1 to Vk, then we have our required L. We will now define the phase of a convex set. So, a closed convex set. So, let K be a closed convex set. Possibly empty. Set K, F in K is called phase of K if there exists a hyperplane H such that H isolates K and F is H intersection K. So it coincides with like our earlier known definition of the face of a polygon. Say suppose you are in R2 and you had this triangle, then this closed triangle, then if you consider this hyperplane, that is the line, then and this is your set K, then L intersection K is this space F. We will now prove the supporting hyperplane theorem. We'll define a supporting hyperplane and prove the supporting hyperplane theorem. Let K be a convex set with a non-empty interior. And let U element of K be U be some element in the boundary of K. Then there exists a hyperplane. It's called the supporting hyperplane. Or the support hyperplane. Such that U element of H and H isolates K. So the proof is a very easy consequence of our isolation theorem. So because K has a non-empty interior, interior of K is an open set. And as we know, in Euclidean space, open is the same as algebraically open. And since U is contained in the boundary of K, U is not contained in the interior of K. Thus, these two things satisfy the conditions of the isolation theorem. So there exists a hyperplane H such that U is contained in it and H isolates the interior of K. But we had already written down a proposition which says that if H isolates interior of K, H indeed isolates K. So we are done. We'll now prove a different version of the isolation theorem for Euclidean spaces. The statement is this: if A is non-empty convex set and U is not contained in A, then there exists hyperplane H. Such that U is contained in H and H isolates A. So the difference between our earlier isolation theorem was that we required the set to be algebraically open. We are now relaxing that condition for the case of Euclidean space. We'll now prove this. First, let us consider the case when interior of A is not empty. So in this case, this is exactly the supporting hyperplane case. Similar to the supporting hyperplane case, you can just apply the isolation theorem for U not in A and interior of A, and you have your hyperplane. So the interesting case is when interior of A is empty. So again, you can. So we had earlier proved a proposition which said that if a convex set has a empty interior, then you can find a affine subspace of strictly lower dimension which contains A, such that A has non-empty interior. So let L be that affine subspace of strictly lower dimension. Such that A has a non-empty interior. In L, again we consider two cases when U not in L. So this case is very simple. You just have to translate this L up such that this L touches U, then that L prime will do the job of the theorem. So again, more interesting case is when U lies in L. Now, when U lies in L, you are now completely working with this lower dimensional subspace, affine subspace L. You can now apply the isolation theorem inside L. So, so U is now a point in L, U not in A, and A has a non-empty interior. So again, you can apply the case 1, and you are done. So you have essentially proved this more specific version of the isolation theorem for Euclidean. So we have come to the end of the first video. In the next video, we'll be discussing, we'll begin with using the isolation theorems that is proved in this first video to prove a class of theorems called the separation theorems. We will also examine cones and dual cones and how to define inequalities with generalized inequalities with the help of cones. We'll also look at a very important cone called the positive semi-definite cone. So thank you.